Hello, AP World History students. Mr. Lassiter here for our live broadcast. So we'll go ahead and get started. I've made it home. It says I can broadcast up to 8 hours, but I hope that we can be done in, say, 30 or 40 minutes. Hopefully you are seeing what I'm saying. I don't know if I can get some confirmation that you have sound. That would be great, because that was always the problem last year, at least in the earliest ones that we did. So the chat, it looks like people have kind of started here. Thanks for the confirmation on the audio, Morgan. So we'll just go ahead and get started with your questions. So we'll be here as long as you have questions, or until I get tired. I've been sitting in a car all day, but we made it back. My newest nephew, is adorable, and I really like him. So as soon as you start shooting some questions, we can begin. As a reminder, the test will be somewhere between 25 and 30 multiple choice questions tomorrow, and a short answer question on our first test. You'll have a long essay question and a short answer on our second. Overall, I'd say it breaks down for maybe 80% questions based on a stimulus of some kind, maybe 20% that are not. Those are pretty straightforward questions. Mostly, of course, this will follow the key concepts, but you will see information, of course, background content from your textbook. So anyways, so that's pretty much the information on your test. Don't forget to take a look at Google Classroom for the resources, the review resources, if you want to review any more tonight. Yeah, so as soon as you start asking some questions, we'll get started. Otherwise, it'll be a pretty short review. First question: what do you think is most important to study? Ooh, that's tough. The key concepts, I would say. Making sure that you have those down, at least the major themes that we see in those key concepts down. But what people should study is up to them. It may be that you took really solid notes one day in class, and perhaps in another you didn't take great notes, and so it's really individualized there. So I can't tell you exactly what to study, I guess. So that's the answer to that one. You can keep them coming. You don't have to wait for a question to be finished before somebody pops up another one. Usually I run behind a little bit on these questions from where you might be, and that's okay. So just kind of keep that in mind. Do we need to know where the places are on the map by memory? So that is one thing that you need to know. Geography is important. In our next unit, you will have a geography test, but you do need to know where our foundational civilizations are located. You certainly need to know the river valleys that each one goes with. So as a recap, of course, Egypt is on the Nile River Valley. I don't think anybody ever forgets that one. Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Shang period of China, the Shang civilization developed along the Yellow River. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, that's along the Indus Valley. Sometimes we just call it the Indus River Valley civilization. The Olmecs in Mesoamerica, and the Chavin in the Andes Mountains of South America. So that's really the only major geography you need to know. Other geographic things, I think, obviously, like where the continents and oceans are, that'll be something that we go over. We'll spend a lot more time on that next unit. But you need to know like where humans originated in Africa, maybe generally know about the Bantu migrations. within Africa, although we spend some more time on that next unit. All right. Next question here. Will there be, the second part of that was, will there be maps on the test? There might be some maps that are the stimulus for a question. So you might have to identify like what's being shown on a map. How much time we have for the test? Because we're doing map testing, Marm. That's a good question. The test will take the entire time period. So when you get into the classroom, you need to make sure you have your pen, pencil. Don't bother to take anything out to cram. You should be ready to go from the second you get in the room. I'll hand out everything right away. And we'll go from the moment it starts probably all the way to the very end of class. So thinking about the schedule, I'm actually going to look it up right now just to double check to see how long class periods are, because that will determine whether or not you have 25 or 30 multiple choice questions. And it looks like classes are about 40 minutes. So yeah, probably looking at 25 questions, multiple choice for that 40 minutes, so we can fit the SAQ in. All right. They're going to be general questions or specific questions. So no questions are really nitpicky on an AP exam. They just can't be. There's just way too much content. You have to know a good deal of information. If you know the key concepts, you'll know enough of that. If you've read your textbook and taken some notes or done those reading guides, then you'll have the general information that you need to know to be able to reason through the questions. Remember, the questions we practiced in class aren't, what year was this thing written? That'll be given information, but you have to use your knowledge of the trends of history to deduce some or arrive at some conclusion for the practice questions. So, yeah, you never really have to know like specific dates for me. You can ballpark dates. I'd say probably the one off the top of my head in this time period, dates 200,000 years ago, humans, Homo sapiens evolve. 10,000 years ago, humans learned to farm. 1500 BC, roughly, we enter the Iron Age. Those are the major dates from this time period. Are there any questions similar to what was on the practice test? So the practice that we did Friday, yes, that'll be the majority. There'll be at least half the questions on the test will look like that. Will the questions be harder than the practice test? No, I think there will be some that are harder. There will be some that are easier, depending on the stimulus and the content covered and how much you study. That really determines the difficulty of the questions. Some standard questions about like pens and things. Yeah, any blue or black ink pen, dark blue or black ink pen will do. Any type of pencil will do for this one. If you're allotted extended time, you will get that extended time. That will be done during seminar or after school or in class the next day. How important will Norte Chico be on the test? Ooh, good question. So I'm realizing I'm not holding my standard Coke Zero that usually sponsors these videos, or that I'm trying to get to sponsor these videos. So if any of you knows anyone who works for them. Norte Chico is an excellent example of one of our foundational civilizations. It's given as an example in your text of something that predates the Chavin civilization, as an example of kind of early civilization developing in the Andes mountain regions. The key concepts, though, focuses on the Chavin. For most of these early foundational civilizations, you don't need to know really extreme specifics about any of them, but you do need to know what develops in And, after you get farming, after you get civilization, people being organized into, and we see governments arise. We see kind of those hallmarks of civilization. I gave you notes the other day. And understand that happened kind of in every place. Usually when the American civilizations come up, it is in a question of comparison to Afro-Eurasian civilizations. Because we see farming develop much later in some of those regions, or we see that trade from north to south is not as easy from east to west. So those are the types of questions you might see. Because the Chavin civilization is mentioned in the key concepts and not Nordichico, that will be the more important thing to know. Will there be content from the textbook or reading quizzes? Yes. Yes, that content is background content for everything you do. It's background content for all the writing you do and for reasoning through what you see on the test. So yes, you will see lots of crossover, especially from this textbook. Our old textbook, sometimes not as much, so I would add specific questions in. But there's a lot more crossover in this textbook. Also, one of the best things about our Strayer book that I like is how comparative it is. So if you have seen so far, it does a lot of comparing one civilization to another. And that's one of my kind of favorite things about this book. Even, I just opened the book I have here on pages 62 and 63. It has like that big map showing where the first civilizations are, and it lines up really well with the AP World requirements and key concepts. And then it talks about the different civilizations and origins and urban revolutions. So those types of things are, instead of just taking, here's a chapter on Egypt, here's a chapter on Mesopotamia, it's really kind of works them together to show the trends that occur in history. So that's what you should be getting out of the textbook, and hopefully you'll be getting some specific evidence that you can use in your writing. I don't think you should panic. Yeah. How much weight does this test have? Well, it will be 50% of your grade so far because it's the only test that you'll have. The SAQ will go in as well. Tests are weighted heavier, multiple choice are weighted heavier than SAQs, and essays are weighted heavier than SAQs as well. So those are so, I mean, it will be a substantial part of your grade, at least right now. Typically, the period 1 test is the test that people perform the best on early in the year until we get to about units 5 and 6. And then we see kind of grades pick back up at the end as you get a hang of the course. A little bit about the Chavin civilization. So when we think about this civilization, so the question is, can you please expand a little on the Chavin civilization. So this is a civilization that's brought up in the key concepts as a foundational civilization. It is one that you need to know the location of, which I know is kind of odd to say, like, just know the location of this place. It is usually not one that we see a ton of very specific questions about, because we don't know as much about the early, how do I say this? We don't know as much about the early American civilizations as we do about some of our Afro-Eurasian civilizations. So that's kind of one thing to consider. The questions can't be terribly deep beyond maybe showing images perhaps of how or examples of civilization in this region, and see if you can like pick out maybe irrigation systems or examples of specialization, or maybe they show some images of like quipu, right, that come out of the Andes Mountains, and you have to know that as a system of record keeping. So those are the types of questions that you might get with it. Knowing kind of the specifics is not quite as important as knowing the similarities, right? So we have powerful civilizations, we have cities develop with complex bureaucracies, we see examples of religion, we usually see some type of military that has developed in these early civilizations. We know they have agricultural surpluses, which lead to specialization. We know that there's trade, right? And long distance trade. So those are the types of things that we expect you to know. For the Chavin, they're in the Andean region. They are a precursor to all the civilizations that come, especially the Inca civilization, which is kind of like the height of civilization in South America. Although that's not until really the 1400s. And we can talk about kind of why that is the case. Some other things to consider, I would say, with kind of South American civilization, thinking about, what they domesticated, right? Potatoes predominantly. And then that in the Americas, we see civilization develop, but without domesticated pack animals. The only exceptions to that are in South America, where we see alpacas and llamas be used. Although they are limited in what they can do. Their carrying capacity, for example, does not even come close to horses and camels. But that's something to consider. They do have those pack animals in South America. All right, so that's all the things I can think of off the top of my head dealing with that. If you get anything else asked on the test, I would be surprised. Will there be a question relating to the working with evidence passages sections from the textbook? So those working with evidence sections of your book are really great in terms of practicing your analysis and your documents. They have some really great introductions to the documents and give you some explanations. We will use some of them in class, and you may see some of them on the test because some of them are really well-known documents that are really rich. The skills that you get from reading primary sources and thinking about primary sources, it's going to help you on the test the most. This is not a test of memorization. It is not a test of, did I study the exact right people or the right dates? It's a test of skills. So those sections are important for practicing those skills over and over again. Some of those are written texts. Some of them are visual texts. And so it's going to give you a lot of practice with all of those types of primary and secondary sources. Well, I guess those sections are mainly primary sources, but you get what I'm saying. What date did you say was the Iron Age? 1500 BCE, roughly, is what we see with the Hittites and the development of iron. So that's the date that's generally given. Good question about the Bantu migration. So can I expand a little bit on the Bantu migrations? The Bantu migrations are in Africa. We talk about them a little bit more in later units, but basically what kind of the evidence shows is that the Bantu people were originated in West Africa, right? This kind of Bantu culture, this Bantu language group. They were noteworthy, not just for their language, but for developing iron making technology, although maybe not iron making technology that really rivaled mass production in China. But they had the ability of this iron metallurgy, and they also were farmers. And due to maybe population pressure or most likely environmental pressure over thousands of years in kind of different waves, we see people migrating, these Bantu peoples, out of West Africa into East and Southern Africa. And with their migrations, they bring knowledge of agriculture, which spreads throughout Southern and Eastern Africa, especially like yams and the like. We also see the spread of iron metallurgy and the knowledge of how to make iron. And then we also see the spread of the Bantu language, which kind of mixes with different languages in sub-Saharan Africa. and kind of creates the Bantu family of languages, which eventually will also influence Swahili on the eastern coast of Africa, but that'll also be influenced by Arabic and some other languages. The Bantu migrations we'll talk about more and more, but it is an excellent example of migration in this time period. And yeah, and so your book will probably have a little bit on it. If you go to AP Worldopedia, there should be a little on that from Key Concept 1.3, I believe. 1.2 or 1.3 has a little bit on the Bantu migrations. Yeah, so yeah, that's pretty much what you need to know there. All right, next question. Hey, look, Asher has made his presence known. Celebrity sighting, everyone. Former WAPTR, Asher Wexler. All right. How much will we expect to know about the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou dynasties? So the main thing for this test is know that those are all, they all fit within this time period. In my class, I tend to spend more time on those dynasties of China in our next unit, because we're going to talk a lot about the foundations for Chinese civilization as we get into, the Warring States period and the development of Confucianism, legalism, and Taoism, and ultimately the Qin dynasty coming around and unifying China really for the first time. So the term dynasty for Shang and Zhou and Xia, which is probably like just a mythical dynasty, that is, kind of, it's a name that's given to it, but we tend to think of them kind of as eras still pretty decentralized in China. Know that the Shang refers to the Shang period, the early Yellow River Valley civilization. In our next unit, we'll spend a lot more time thinking about those more specifically. But I would say you don't need to know really any more about them than any of the other River Valley civilizations. Just know that those hallmarks of civilization develop in each of those areas, or in China as well. All right. All right, let's see what else. Yeah, so Abby, that's great information with Swahili. Yeah, the Bantu migrations are going to be one of our examples of how migration affects language. Polynesian migrations will be another example of that. So that'll be a theme in the course of how these types of migrations can affect culture. And we also see with Swahili like a good blend of culture. So we see words from like Hindi and Arabic and even Portuguese eventually when the Portuguese start trading in the Indian Ocean, and like traditional African languages kind of all come together to form the Swahili language. And it relates to the Swahili coast, or the eastern coast of Africa, which was a prominent trade area in the Indian Ocean. But we'll get to that really in time period 3. We really see those Swahili city-states take off. So that's another great reason why period 3 is the best. Will there be questions about patriarchy or how it developed in each area? Yes, there most likely will be questions about the development of patriarchy in agricultural communities and kind of so knowing the general path to patriarchy, the general conditions that bring about patriarchy, will be something that you need to know, and that is something I would definitely send you to your book to look at. If you look in, I think it's chapter 1 or 2, there is hierarchies of gender and the development of the erosion of equality. So that's around pages like 72 to 75. I would say go back through that and kind of review some of the theories or leading reasons or leading beliefs of why patriarchy develops. So that's what I would say to take a look back at your Strayer book. That gives you a really good overview of the development of patriarchy, which is certainly like an important part of the key concepts in this unit. What should we know about Zoroastrianism and the early Persian civilization on the test? Well, that is the best question of the day. We're going to talk a lot about Persia in the next unit. In fact, Persia is really my favorite example of how empires come to be formed and are able to rule over or maintain control of the region they take over. And Zoroastrianism was an important part of that. It is kind of a traditional Persian religion. Zoroastrianism develops in Persia, in kind of the greater Middle East, Southwest Asia. And it is a kind of a dualistic religion. It is it was the religion of Persia all the way up really until it's supplanted by Islam much later on in our course. And whether or not it's monotheistic or not, some say, well, there's kind of this good God and evil God. Some would say it's monotheistic. There's the good God because good will win out in the end. That God is Ahura Mazda, which is just like a baller name. But there's still Zoroastrians in the world today. Smaller numbers. I think it's less than 1 million, maybe, Zoroastrians left in the world today. But the getting back to this, so there's this idea of this eternal cosmic struggle between good and evil. Like that is what Zoroastrianism is about, and it's a religion all about ethics, right? If you live an ethical, moral life, then you will eventually like achieve, eternal life for the good, or if you do not, you will get like eternal damnation, right? So you're kind of waiting for this final judgment. The name for the religion, Zoroastrianism, comes from the kind of Greek name for the prophet of the religion, Zoroaster. So this is kind of like a traditional religion of Persia. It was used to unite Persians for a long time, even though in the early Persian Empire, which we'll study in our next unit, people may practice more than one religion. This became kind of a uniting factor in the Persian Empire for all Persians. Zoroastrianism, as you could probably sense, the way I was describing it, really has a major influence on other religions. It has an influence on Christianity, and well, before Christianity, Judaism, and later on Islam. The ideas of like ethics, the idea of this eternal struggle between good and evil, the idea of monotheism in general. All of this are features of Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism also has some pretty cool other kind of interesting features. One of kind of the more noteworthy of ancient Zoroastrianism is this idea of like purity of the body. So when people died, they might be like exposed on a hillside, and basically they would be going like back into nature. So like this cyclical nature, and so they would have, so animals like would pick their bones clean, basically. So there's kind of that part of Zoroastrianism too. So there's a lot of really good stuff. There's actually a website online. I know that some people who did their project on their Sacred Spaces project last year on Zoroastrianism used. So you can kind of look that up. I think they even emailed the person who runs that website and got some really cool answers about it, about some of the things they do. There is, in a Zoroastrian temple, there are like an eternal fire that's kept burning, right? This idea of like purity and fire and water. So it's a really fascinating religion, although with dwindling numbers. And the main reason for that is because of the movement to Islam in Persia, although there are still pockets of Zoroastrians in Persia today and in other parts of the world. All right. Wow. I went off the rails with that one. But great question. I love talking about it. How much do you need to know about trade? Ooh, good question. So some general things that are traded, you have pastoral peoples or nomadic peoples that can't make things like metal, or can't won't be able to have enough food. So they may trade items for food from settled agricultural communities. These agricultural communities might get things that they can't make, things that are brought from far away, that hunter-gatherer groups or nomadic groups, usually pastoralist groups, bring from further away. Also, ideas spread, of course, through trade. So those are just a couple examples of things that are traded. But in terms of like the trade, what you need to know about the trade routes in this unit, it's pretty simple. There's not a lot to know. There was trade between Egypt and Nubia to the south. Nubia was the only source, really, or one source for like gold and ivory and slaves, and that is going to be kind of a continuity into our next time period. So they traded with Egypt. Egypt traded with Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia traded with India, and there are some evidence that maybe some of the goods from far away as China may have made it into that region. So that's really what we see. There are improvements for trade and transportation. For example, wheeled vehicles help with trade and transportation. Finished goods, metal goods, pottery, things like that are some other items that are traded in this time period. So I think that's the big stuff. Of course, as we get closer to the end of this time period, we'll see ideas start to be traded. And in our next time period, we'll see those ideas really spread. Religions spread, philosophies spread, ways of governing spread via trade. So yeah, a lot of good stuff with trade. We're not kind of in the weeds yet. We're not getting too deep into it. So generally know what regions traded with each other, and just a couple examples. Yeah, okay, so great. Thanks for looking up the numbers. 200,000-ish to 250,000 probably is what I've heard. Zoroastrians kind of in the world today. So yeah, those numbers have dwindled quite a bit. There were some really cool articles I think I've shared with some people in the past with like a Zoroastrian temple opening in like New York City not too long ago, maybe in the last 4 or 5 years. Question about Zorro and Zoroastrianism. No, that's Zorro means the fox in Spanish. And Zoroaster, the name for the prophet of Zoroastrianism, is a Greekification of the name Zarathustra, the prophet of Zoroastrianism. More questions about Zoroastrianism. Sacred spaces, how long they burn? I don't have an idea for that. I think they just try to keep them going. I'm not sure exactly, though. A good question about slavery in these time periods. So slavery is going to be a continuity throughout our course. The main thing to know in this time period is that slavery did exist, that most people who would have been considered slaves or taken as slaves were conquered peoples. As we see warfare start to develop, right? We get surpluses in agriculture, you have militaries develop, warfare follows, right? So conquered peoples often became slaves of others who conquered them. Slavery in this time period did not necessarily mean generational slavery. That was a more modern invention where slavery becomes associated with someone's place of birth or their color of their skin. And that if your parent was a slave, then you were a slave. That is more descriptive of the chattel slavery of the 18th and 19th centuries. The slavery that we see in this course is people being conquered in battle and then forced to kind of work in the or pay off somehow their freedom to their conquerors. So that would be really what I'd say that you'll see if you see many questions about it in this time period. That's not to say that people weren't treated horribly and it was a horrible thing, obviously, but it was certainly continuity in this time period and into our next and the one after and the one after. We need to know religious belief systems that develop and their location of origin. Yes, that is something that I think will be good to know. Let me see if I can find what I do with my key concepts here. I can give you an idea of which ones you need to know. But I think I closed them in front of me. So Judaism, I think, would be the one of the most significant. And we've already talked about Zoroastrianism in Persia. The development of Hebrew monotheism, which really develops out of Mesopotamian religions. There is evidence that, maybe the early, as Hebrew monotheism, what eventually becomes known as Judaism, gets started, that it might have been monolatrous, meaning that they believed perhaps that there were many gods, but they worshipped only one of those gods, the God of the Hebrew people, who was greater than all the other gods. But as it continues to develop, and we can kind of see this with like Old Testament stories of like competitions between gods, so like light flames and lead people out of Egypt and the like. But as it continues to develop, it becomes not just our God is better than your God, and this is the God we pray to, and but that no, our God is the only God. This God is, necessitates there is the existence of no other, basically, by definition. So that's something that we tend to see with the development of Hebrew monotheism. So that develops in kind of the Mesopotamian region, eventually settling down in what is now called like the Holy Land or Palestine. It was called Palestine for a long time. Now it's like basically where the country of Israel is today. And Hebrew monotheism is perhaps one of the most influential religions in the world, although not necessarily the largest religion in the world today. Noteworthy mainly for its influence on Christianity and Islam. So we usually call Judaism, Christianity, and Islam Abrahamic religions because they all trace their history back to Abraham or Ibrahim in Arabic. The kind of first monotheist, the first one to really embrace monotheism and then kind of spread the news about it, so to speak. So, of course, Christianity develops directly out of Judaism, and then Islam develops later, but also traces its roots back to Abraham. So those influences of Hebrew monotheism are quite important. So know they develop in the Southwest Asia region, what we now refer to as the Middle East. And then the last religious belief system that you really need to know is really the roots of Hinduism, especially the Vedic traditions, Vedic. These traditions are brought to India, historians believe, in migrations, Aryan migrations into India, bringing the Vedic hymns with them. So these were like a collection of like songs or chants that kind of like holy poems that are passed down or passed between generation to generation. And and so they start to merge with local South Asian beliefs and eventually will form the part of what we call modern Hinduism. So that's roughly what the three big ones I think that you need to know. Of course, there are a lot of examples of polytheism. The comparison of the Egyptian religion to Mesopotamian religion is often something that pops up on the AP exam. There are different outlooks on life, which we discussed in class on Friday. Let's see. Yes, slaves were traded between Egypt and Nubia. I'm going to answer these questions kind of quickly because we only going to have about 5 more minutes here. Hittites are start of Imperial conquest. Yeah, pretty much. We consider kind of the Hittites the first ones to really build that empire based on conquest with our iron weapons, although there were small kind of kingdoms in Mesopotamia. Sicknesses were the most common. Ooh, don't know. There definitely were like sicknesses and epidemics as people started to domesticate animals and live kind of in close quarters. That's one of the arguments brought up by Jared Diamond in the Worst Mistake article that you read, that people generally were less healthy. I don't have specific ones for this unit that you need to know, though. What were the religious practices of Paleolithic people? Yes, great question. So keep in mind that really before we start to see organized religion develop, one of the we often think of like Paleolithic peoples or others as religious. Their religion we describe as like animist, dealing with this idea of animism is sometimes what it's called. This belief that spirits inhabit kind of the spiritual, the natural world, and so that there's kind of a blending or an interaction between kind of the corporeal world, the physical world in which we live, and then the spiritual world. And so you had people getting in touch with nature, perhaps like shaman or certain like elders of tribes who might be responsible for bridging that connection between the corporeal or physical and the natural world. That's generally what we see. Animist religions still exist today. They will be persistent throughout this course. So that's a great question. Historically more popular and long-lasting, monotheism or polytheism? Tough question. Look it up. Will you be able to retake or make up the test? No, but you do get a curve on the test. And you will, in order to get that, you must do test corrections. So we'll talk about what those should look like in class on Tuesday. All right. I think I'm down to the end here. So we will call it a night. Your test is tomorrow. We're going to need the entire class. So if you have any lingering questions, those need to be asked of me at lunch tomorrow. You can come in with your 1 or 2 questions. It won't be a review session, but if you have something that's just gnawing at you that you need to ask, you can go ahead and ask that tomorrow. And yeah, other than that, y'all will do fine. Don't get bogged down in the dirty details. Just make sure that you are getting a good night's sleep tonight and that you eat breakfast tomorrow. And if you want a really good breakfast, bring $2.50 and get a waffle from the Model UN Club, who will be selling them out in the lobby tomorrow morning. So every day, waffle days this week. Enjoy, and I will see you tomorrow. Adios.